Well, welcome to our seminar today, a research seminar. A former CSAC fellow coming back to talk about his extremely interesting work. My name is David Holloway. I'm a former co-director of CSAC and director of FSI. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Terry Peterson here to talk about the book that he published just this year with Cornell University Press. So the topic is revolutionary warfare, how the Algerian War made modern counterinsurgency, or made modern counterinsurgency. This is his first book. He's an associate professor of history at Florida International University. He's published widely. The main focus of his work is France and the French Empire, with particular attention to decolonization, to counterinsurgency, to migration, a range of very interesting topics. His current project for his second book is a study of an internment or concentration or detention camp in the south of France, the Rivesaltes camp, which operated from the late 1930s until 2007, and saw waves of different prisoners, migrants, refugees go through it. So it actually sounds like an utterly fascinating window through which to examine a number of very important topics. Terry has won the top teaching prize at Florida International University. He also won the prize from the Society of Military History, the Van der Voort Prize for an outstanding journal article on military history. So we're looking forward very much to your talk.
Thank you. I have to say it's a really pleasure to be back at CSAC. You know, campus seems very different, but also the same. And it's really lovely to see some familiar faces. I'll note the one person I miss today being here is Rod Ewing, who unfortunately left us this summer. He was very generous when I was a postdoc. All right. So in mid-May 1956, the new socialist government of France laid out a radical vision for French strategy in Algeria. And the North African territory, which was home to 1 million Europeans and about 9 million indigenous Algerians, was considered part and parcel of France rather than a colony. But it had plunged into violent conflict with the emergence of a new nationalist organization, the National Liberation Front, or the FLN, on All Saints' Day, 1954, right? And granted sweeping special powers, the government now turned to the army, not only as a weapon to crush the FLN, but as a tool to regenerate Algerian society, strengthen its ties with metropolitan France, and win Algerians' enduring loyalty. Right? France's enemies declared the new prime minister, Guy Mollet, must know the power of a strengthened French army, but this army would also bear profound reforms as a tool for goodwill alongside its more conventional weaponry. Here's Algeria in 1954 for you. Now, in many ways, this emphasis on winning Algerian hearts and minds marked a really unprecedented shift, right? Little more than a decade earlier, in 1945, France had responded to popular nationalist protest in the Algerian cities of Sétif and Guelma with a series of swift and brutal repressions that killed an estimated 8,000 to 10,000 Algerians, right? Reforms promised in the aftermath were simply ignored or boldly circumvented. What changed in the short period between 1945 and 1954? Why did the French army now see its task not only as one of conventional combat and repression, but also of social reform, and how did it seek to embrace this new role? In fact, when I began to dig through carton after carton of documents in the French military archives, these questions only seem to multiply, right? Why did a campaign to quash anti-colonial revolution become an effort to rethink the nature of warfare itself, right? Why has modern warfare writ large often been an exercise in development as often as it has been a combat exercise? Why is the Algerian War still a case study for modern counterinsurgency when French Algeria is no longer found on any map? Right? The Algerian War raged from 1954 to 1962, and in fact, it played a pivotal role in the global process of decolonization. It redrew the human and geographic borders of the Mediterranean. It fatally undermined the legitimacy of colonial rule. It rewrote the rules of international diplomacy. It helped launch the Third Worldist movement, right? But in many respects, the established narratives of the war itself remain oddly partitioned off from this global context, right? Historians have explored international mobilizations in favor of the FLN, but most continue to paint the French army and its actions with a broad brush, right, as the last gasp of the same kind of violence that shaped colonial rule from its start, or as the product of lost soldiers who are like off in the colonies for too long by themselves, driven to extremes. And the result is that scholars have often left the dynamics and meaning of much of the war's violence unanalyzed, right? The story that they tell about the French response to Algerian independence remains largely one of exceptionalism that reflects French colonial ideology's own claims to the sort of exceptional place of Algeria within the French Empire. Now, the story that began to emerge from the archives and from dozens of interviews that I conducted across France and Algeria really seemed to stand in stark contrast to these narratives, right? French officers and colonial officials were not just reactionary defenders of the status quo, but sought instead to pursue their own project of radical social transformation that might preserve Algeria against the global challenges of decolonization, right? Likewise, they didn't approach this project in isolation, but in dialogue with a range of foreign military partners who are grappling with similar issues at the same moment. In fact, as they drew together their sort of new systems of repression and surveillance with a program of armed social reform into a coherent military doctrine, the French army looked abroad not just for inspiration, but to promote its own practices as a universal solution to the upheavals of the era. So as I argue in this book that I'm talking about today, this one here, you'll see a bunch of pictures of it because I brought all the promotional materials I could possibly carry on the airplane, right? French officers' efforts to transform warfare into an exercise in social engineering not only shaped how the Algerian War unfolded from its very start, but also helped forge a paradigm of warfare that has dominated from the Cold War to our present day, namely counterinsurgency. Okay. So to give you a sense of the book's arc and arguments, I want to briefly explore the development of the French army's strategy in Algeria, which was known as pacification, right? And pacification was not merely a euphemism for violence, even though it was plenty violent, right? But rather it was a set of institutions and practices that sought to dismantle Algerian social structures and rebuild them from the ground up in order to undercut support for the revolution and bind Algerians more closely to the French state, right? So first, I'm going to talk about this broad context of colonial reform that frames the war and the way that civilian and military officials both came to see the army as an ideal vehicle for social change. Second, I'm going to talk about how this reformist project converged with a particular French understanding of subversion amidst the Cold War into a coherent operational doctrine by 1957. Then I'm going to briefly zoom in to look at one of the ways that one of these pacification programs, known as the MC, functioned on the ground. And finally, I'll touch on some of the reasons why the French war effort in Algeria proved so influential and the implications for the book for how we ought to think about modern counterinsurgency. Ultimately, pacification collapsed under the weight of its own violent contradictions. but French officers' efforts to reimagine warfare continue to reverberate. Okay, let's talk about colonial reform as a form of counter-revolution. If you don't read French, this says, in Algeria, France is redoing the French Revolution. Okay. Now, the Algerian Revolution materialized at a moment of acute uncertainty about the future of the French Empire and France's place in the world. Right? After the Second World War, as many of you know, an international order developed that emphasized human rights and national self-determination. French leaders themselves played a role in this, right? In 1946, they rechristened their empire as a French Union and set out to liberalize colonial rule. And yet the challenges to colonial rule from within and without the French Empire exploded in the decade that followed. Right? In Algeria, even the most modest effort at reform failed in the face of settler intransigence and governmental infighting. A demographic crisis and a weak Algerian economy only compounded a sense of impotence. Algeria's legal, human, fiscal foundations all seem to have cracked. Right? So by the outbreak of the war then, a significant number of civil and military leaders felt as if their model of colonial rule had expired, right? Politically, socially, economically. Their leaders saw this outmoded system itself rather than any nationalist alternative as the motor driving Algerian support for the FLN. Right? As one French officer told me, the era of colonization had passed. It was necessary to create a new political framework where Algerians could thrive. This guy, Jacques Soustelle, was the perfect man to build such a framework. Right? He became Governor General of Algeria in 1955. He's not your sort of typical colonial official. He was a member of the French resistance. He was close to Charles de Gaulle. What's more, he was an ethnologist, and he spent a lot of time in Mexico working on efforts to promote indigenous people's rights during the 1930s and 1940s. And from his earliest day in office, Soustelle called France to admit the sort of structural role that racism had played within colonial society as the foundation for a counter effort to promote the equality of Algerians. Right? He laid out a broad slate of reforms aimed at harmonizing Algeria's legal code and economy with metropolitan France, a sort of European integration style incorporation that he really cleverly named integration, right? Now, rhetorically, this is not a radical shift, right? The French state had long sort of justified colonialism as a civilizing mission, aimed at uplifting colonized peoples under French tutelage, right? And this sort of ostensibly progressive vision of empire that Soustelle now articulated reasserted that vision, right? You get a sense with this sort of very patronizing poster. Here's Algeria as a child being led up the stairs of time by Charles de Gaulle, right? He's got the stars on his sleeve. Sorry, that's my fault. Where Soustelle differed was in the insistence that a creation of a truly equal society in Algeria required more than just an extension of civil rights, right? After all, Algerians had technically been full French citizens since 1947. So in his view, fixing the Algerian problem also required a comprehensive effort at social and economic reform, opening access to education, employment, and social assistance for Algerians. In his words, banning all discrimination to Algerians' detriment is not enough. We must not hesitate to establish discrimination to their advantage where necessary. What that meant in practical terms, you can get a sense from these propaganda posters up here on the screen, right? A project of intense state intervention aimed at land reform, economic modernization, education, social welfare, workforce development for Algerians, right? In other words, the idea of integration drove French administrators to see liberalizing reforms, even coerced if necessary, as an integral component of the war effort against the FLN. Right? So from early on in the war, Soustelle and his peers already framed the French response to the FLN as an effort to regenerate the colonial state rather than just repress an insurgent enemy. Now, of course, the problem for Soustelle is that he doesn't actually have the power to carry out these reforms, right? This all sounds really great, but first, he doesn't have the power because the civil administration lacks the necessary boots on the ground. And second, he faces a powerful settler lobby that's opposed to any kind of reform, right? They've long blocked any kind of reform. So he has to find some workarounds, right? The first workaround to address the first problem of boots on the ground was to create a new organization that Soustelle called the Special Administrative Sections, or the SAS, right? And this is a corps of officers modeled on the old 19th century Arab bureaus who hold both civil and military powers in rural circumscriptions where the state is not necessarily present, right? And Soustelle sees these officers as the building blocks for new administration. He calls them the beating heart of France in every douar, which is the French word for rural village. Soustelle's successor, Robert Lacoste, by the way, I love this picture of Robert Lacoste. They've just discovered oil and Hassi Massoud. He is so happy, right? Now, his successor, Robert Lacoste, resolves the second problem, right? Within weeks of coming to power, replacing Soustelle in early 1956, Lacoste demands special powers to circumvent the normal rule of law in Algeria and allow the French army to operate with impunity. And French legislators overwhelmingly grant these powers. This very same law allows Lacoste the ability to abolish Algeria's legislative bodies and ram Soustelle's reforms through over the objections of settlers. And Lacoste set to work immediately, right? He followed Soustelle's lead and he looked not just to the SAS, but to the army writ large to begin implementing these reforms on the ground, quote unquote, in his words, right, straightening out this shit show of an administration, right? He is sort of a bully boy, ready to assert his vision. Now, historians often dismiss recasting France's civilizing mission as a modernizing mission, as mere rebranding, right? This is a PR move, but I think it accomplished three subtle but important changes. The first is that it reframes Algerian difference not as racial, but as social and economic, and therefore mutable. The second is that it transformed the colonial mission into a program of accelerated social reform, right? French leaders are now emphasizing Algerian difference not as a strategy of exclusion, but as an excuse to intervene in an incredibly heavy-handed way. And finally, it's going to militarize this program of reform by pushing it into the hands of the French army. And in fact, civil officials will only reinforce this militarization as the war progresses by pushing more and more responsibility for such programs into the hands of military leaders who really begin to embrace reform as their own special mission. Okay, let's talk about how this becomes a method of warfare. Now, this reformist impulse is not the only strand of strategic thinking that shaped the French war effort, right? By early 1957, it begins to converge with two other theories of war in places like the High War College in Paris and in policy institutes and military intellectual circles on both sides of the Mediterranean. Right? The first one is a nascent theory of what French officers called revolutionary warfare. Right? This is the idea that atomic warfare had somehow transformed war into a subversive struggle for the loyalty of the population rather than the control of territories. Right? It's an idea largely articulated by mid-level officers who'd fought in World War II and then in Indochina in a variety of colonial war zones, and now returned to Paris to take up research positions in military academies. Many of them had spent significant time in Viet Minh re-education camps, right? So you'll pick up a little bit of an inflection of Marxism there in some of what they're talking about, and it's because they know Marxism really well, right? Theorists like Colonel Charles Lachois or General Lionel Max Chassin argued that the war in Algeria was not a revolution, but part of the global revolutionary war against the West waged by communists using subversive strategies first deployed by Mao and refined by the Viet Minh. Right? And the aim of this form of warfare was to turn the population of a territory against the established government using propaganda and clandestine coercive organizations that could mobilize civilians. So in essence, these officers are trying to theorize a response to anti-colonial liberation struggles in the global South, but also sort of explain away the popular support for those struggles, particularly in Algeria. The second set of ideas that you can see is sort of mixed up with revolutionary warfare up here is the emergent discipline of psychological warfare, right, that really exploded in the wake of World War II. Allied militaries were fascinated by the apparent scientific ability of the Soviets and the Nazis to manipulate the human psyche through mass media. And one of the big discussions taking place in the sort of decade after World War II between NATO allies alongside nuclear weapons was how to build capacities for this new form of psy-war. Now, partly because of these efforts, you have, by the mid-1950s, within the French army, a new core of psy-war officers who emerge, who draw on sort of popular psychologies, pop psychologies, really, of Jung and Pavlov, and workplace management theories to argue that they can condition certain behaviors and even reflexes of loyalty through images and slogans, right? Spoiler alert, they cannot. It doesn't work. Now, all three of these strands, reformism, revolutionary warfare, the sort of psy-war idea, they all converge in the spring of 1957 in an important pilot operation in the north of Algeria, cleverly named Pilot Operation, right? Opération Pilote in French. Now, when we think about French strategy in Algeria, we often think about the Battle of Algiers taking place at the very same moment. And it's true that the Battle of Algiers played a key role in shaping French intelligence practices and urban operations, right? But in 1957, this is a sort of a broad moment of experimentation, and arguably Operation Pilot played an important, if not much more important role in the Army's rural operations, which were a major part of the war, right? You can see Algiers up there on the coast. This is the entire zone for Operation Pilot. So it's a much larger sort of operation at the moment. Now, Operation Pilot was spearheaded by these two men, Colonel Michel Gousseau, who's the head of the Psy-War Bureau in Algeria. Everyone sort of remembers him for his like uncanny blue eyes. And ethnographer Jean Servier, who you can see over there, he's sort of like your classic academic grifter hoping to make it big in defense circles. No one that we know, right? And the idea behind Operation Pilot is really that the Army would develop a multi-stage operational strategy that could not only root out and destroy the FLN, but also replace it with some sort of semi-clandestine grassroots political infrastructure that was pro-French, right? And here Gousseau and Servier set out, this is where they set out to, appropriate those kind of Maoist ideas. They explicitly say we're going to use the strategies of our enemy, and they set up programs that target distinct social groups for mobilization, right? So they create self-defense militias for men, medical and social services for women, sports groups for children and young men, and they seek to replace the sort of traditional village council in North Africa, which is known as the Jama, with a pro-French agent who's recruited locally and secretly trained by the Psy-War Bureau, right? And what Gousseau and Servier and others within the French command hoped that this grassroots infrastructure would do is immunize Algerian society against subversion, right? They hoped that it would serve as a tool to transform Algeria along French lines as part of this grand top-down modernizing project articulated by Soustelle. Now, it's worth noting that this effort did not replace the forms of repressive violence, such as torture or forced resettlement, that really characterized the French army's action during the war. It really served to complement them, right? The French, as you can see up here at the top, where it says détruire, construire, the French command argued they had a dual mandate to destroy Algerian social structures that had been commandeered by the FLN and to construct a new Algeria tied ever more closely to France. And what Pilote and its follow-up operations allowed them to do was to fashion all of these various practices that they tested out up through 1957 into a single operational doctrine that remained the basis of French strategy for the rest of the war, right? So they take all the insights from the Battle of Algiers, the stuff from Pilote, the youth sports groups come actually from a different operation around Constantine, and all of it becomes part of this multi-step doctrine of pacification that's really focused as much on mobilizing civilians as on combating an insurgent enemy. So this is the model the army set out to spread across Algeria. It's also the model the French army began to proselytize to their allies through a series of individual and group visits to active combat zones in Algeria. Up here, right, this is the image from the cover. This is from a presentation at the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Powers of Europe in November 1957. And also, at various French military academies and foreign military academies as well. Okay. So that's the big sort of picture. What do these pacifications programs actually do? What do they look like on the ground? In fact, the French army fashioned a whole series of practices and institutions as they sort of struggled to assert this vision of pacification. The number of programs multiply. Every time something doesn't work, they're like, let's make another one, right? Surely this time. But I want to pause here for a moment to zoom in on one of the programs known as the itinerant medical social teams, or the MC, to give you a sense of sort of the general thrust of the army's action and the convoluted social relations that it produced on the ground. Now, Servier and Gousseau created these MC. In fact, you can see this is one of the first teams that Servier is hanging out with in Operation Pilot, right? And they create these MC to target rural women, right? The teams are made up of European and Algerian women recruited as social workers, and they circulate the countryside, offering medical assistance, instruction in hygiene, infant care, basic nutrition, all of these things aimed at making the bodies of Algerians cleaner, healthier, more orderly. Right? During their weekly visits, the MC focus on managing the sort of intimate habits of daily life, bathing children, instructing mothers how to properly swaddle babies, checking to see if homes are properly cleaned. They host communal gatherings for women in order to teach French and household economics and civics lessons. Right? These meetings are intended as a place to collect intelligence and disseminate propaganda, first and foremost, right? But just importantly, French officers also believe that over time, such activities will also cumulatively teach Algerians the attitudes and comportments they need to participate in the industrialized consumer society they hope to create, right? The ultimate goal of sorts for the MC was to create local committees of Algerian women so that they could run these activities themselves. This social work stems in part from the fact that French officers read support for the FLN and for its guerrilla war really through a sort of gendered lens of social disorder. Right? They interpret the Muslim veil as a sign of the sort of same domineering, excessive masculinity that's also leading Algerian men to join the FLN, right? Likewise, they see in the sort of idle, out-of-work bodies of young Algerian men not the effects of dire rural poverty or endemic unemployment, but a sort of a learned cultural laziness rooted in moral underdevelopment, right? And the sort of colonial ideology looms large here, right? French officers reason if they can rebuild Algerian society around the model of the French nuclear family, they'll fix everything. Right? Get rid of the extended kinship structures in Algeria, modernize the family, and we will restore social order, encourage a rapprochement between Algerian settlers and metropolitan French people. Now, because they were meant to serve in part as a propaganda measure, the MC's visits were highly choreographed, right? Very highly choreographed. They often worked alongside propaganda shock teams or arrived right in the wake of a search and sweep operation. And the visit, this visit up here of an MC to the village of Beni Choumeran in June 1957 was sort of typical, right? The MC arrived in the morning and parked their trucks in the shade of these two enormous oak trees. And then, along with a regiment of paratroopers who were carrying their weapons at the time, they worked in an assembly line to bathe all of the village's children in galvanized basins, shaved their heads to fight lice, administered vaccinations, right? Ultimately, they returned them to their parents, adorned in sort of like crisp white linens. Jean Servier visited the operation in his little helicopter in the middle, and he celebrated it as a scene, quote unquote, worthy of the Jordan, a baptism by immersion in the French Republic. Right? It's worth dwelling, though, for a moment on the more ambiguous picture portrayed by most of the photos of the event. Right? These are taken by a propaganda photographer. We have to keep that in mind, but they were never published. And many of the photos depict much more ambiguity on the part of Algerians. Right? People seem bored or maybe uneasy. It's sort of hard to tell. Children almost uniformly seem terrified. There are all these like leering soldiers hanging about as kids are stripped publicly and have their head shaved regardless of their gender. Right? There really seems to be a fundamental disconnect in perceptions between Servier and soldiers mugging for the cameras on one hand and Algerians on the other. And this disconnect is common to many of these operations, right? It means that programs like the MC never operate in the straightforward way that French officers imagine. Now, from 1958 to 1961, Algerians engaged with these programs in really strikingly large numbers, right? And French officers read that engagement as a straightforward indicator that their efforts to mobilize Algerians were succeeding. And in fact, Algerians' willingness to engage helped drive these social programs, right to the heart of French strategy. These programs sometimes generated amicable relationships in local settings, but this only happened at a very particular moment mid-war, and only largely because the Algerian personnel drafted to work on these teams. Most often, Algerians engaged the Army's social programs in strategic and really intentionally ambiguous ways, right? They used the services they needed, whether it's medical care or food aid, and they ignored the other aspects of the programs like propaganda, right? My favorite story is from this little town called Eindhoven, where the officer is just like trying so hard to do propaganda, but all the women who show up for the women's circles just like talk really loud and talk over him, and he can't get a word in edgewise, right? Great passive resistance strategy. The coercive nature of these programs also often means that many Algerians have no choice but to engage with them, right? Whether they need to meet basic needs, they want to escape a degree of surveillance, or because they're literally detained behind the barbed wire barriers of resettlement camps. Right? So faced with such constraints, many rural inhabitants adopt an attitude of sort of deliberate inscrutability or confused disinterest. Right? This vexed military commanders to no end. They looked for any sort of sign of enthusiasm as proof that their programs worked. But this sort of deliberate inscrutability also fit French stereotypes about Arabs and allowed Algerians to escape repercussions for really refusing to cooperate. Now, eventually, this passive accommodation breaks down. So in December 1960, Algerians poured into the streets of major cities in Algeria to vehemently reject French rule. Right? Many of the protesters, and this is an organic phenomenon, it's not led by the FLN, it's a sort of reaction to street violence on the part of settler ultras. And many of the protesters come from the same demographics, and indeed many of the same neighborhoods and communities that the army targeted with these strategies of pacification, in large part because the programs themselves alienated Algerians, right? Algerians chafed at the violence and immiseration imposed on them by the war effort. They chafed at the humiliation and terror of being regularly searched, at being surveilled by armed troops or social assistance, social action teams. On a very basic level, what I found was that French officers fundamentally misunderstood the society they sought to change, and Algerians suffered as a result. Right? One of the things that was the most striking anecdotes when I was in Algeria doing oral histories came not from people I was interviewing, but from a friend of mine named Farid. I had mentioned something about my work, and he asked me, "What are the CES? You keep saying CES, like what are the CES?" And I explained, and he got a bigger and bigger smile on his face as I explained, and he said, "Terry, it's so funny that they're supposed to be the friendly face of the administration, because when I was a naughty little boy, my grandmother used to tell me, be good or the CES will come take you in the night." Right? So pacification, the point I'm trying to make here is that pacification didn't just simply fall short of achieving its objectives, right? The violence and coercion of the strategy, as much as any political development in Algiers or Paris, helped drive Algerians to embrace independence. Okay, here's the fun part. So let's just recap, right? Confronted with this spiraling war of national liberation, French civil and military leaders launched this radical project aimed to transform Algerian society from the ground up. To accomplish this transformation, they fashioned new forms of surveillance and social control that focused on mobilizing civilians, and this imagined process of social reordering failed, right? It profoundly misread Algerian society and, in fact, helped drive Algerians to throw off the yoke of French rule. So why then have French doctrines and practices proven so enduringly influential on modern counterinsurgencies, right? It's always the big question, like the French lose. One reason is the timing and historical context of the war. Right? The Algerian War occurs at a precipitous moment when the US, Britain, other militaries are attempting to develop their own new unconventional strategies for waging war in places like Korea, Malaya, Indonesia, Kenya, Vietnam, right? These efforts evolve in active conversation. And so French officers bore an important imprint on the ontology of the Cold War enemy in the global South, precisely because they captured the zeitgeist of this moment in a sort of like detailed, systematic, actionable doctrine. Sort of more pressing reason, though, is that French officers intentionally sought to capture this influence, right? Through both official and unofficial channels, French officers promoted the doctrines and practices they formulated in Algeria as a sort of universal solution to the revolutionary upheavals of the era, right? Officially, they brought in dozens of foreign officers from Britain, the US, Argentina, Belgium, Brazil, Iran, Israel, Spain, Portugal, and other countries. They brought them into Algeria on observational training visits, beginning with Operation Pilote. As Operation Pilote is still developing, they've got foreign officers there to observe. They also sent foreign advisory training missions to the general staff or to military academies in many of those same countries, right? French officers come very famously to Fort Benning and Fort Bragg here in the US. Unofficially as well, officers whose active duty careers ended with the war set out to gain a foothold in the policy world, right? And also promote French strategies. Right? Lieutenant Colonel Roger Trinquier here in the middle comes to mind, right? His book, Modern Warfare, remains a standard text on the topic. So too does Captain David Galula, the guy with the glasses, whose thinking actually bore no imprint on French strategy during the war, but who afterward found a very eager audience within US defense circles on the cusp of the Vietnam War, right? Galula spent much of his career in Algeria, before Algeria, as a liaison officer for working with Americans, so he knew his audience well, right? And so it's hardly surprising that his work also grabbed the attention of later strategists like General David Petraeus up here. Right? Petraeus resurrected Galula from obscurity in the early 2000s and drew heavily on his ideas to develop his own strategy for Iraq. And many of the myths and omissions that continue to define the stories we tell about the Algerian War today are products of the stories spun by these French officers themselves as they sought to market their ideas to military audiences abroad in this moment. So what implications then for how we think about modern counterinsurgency, right? I think the first one is fairly obvious. We need better case studies, right? We need to approach well-worn narratives more critically, read texts by counterinsurgent theorists much more skeptically, right? Throw David Galula in the trash can. We need to do the actual hard work of archival research and oral history to reconstruct the lived reality of counterinsurgency, right? But more profoundly, and this is my pitch as a historian to the non-historians in the room, right? I think we need to move past an understanding of counterinsurgency itself as a universal trans-historical category of war that look the same across time and space, right? Counterinsurgency, as we understand it today, is the product of a particular historically contingent moment, and it's only in historicizing the form of warfare that we can begin to reassess some of the core assumptions that continue to shape that understanding, right? The ideas about human psychology or cultural tutelage or a vast Maoist conspiracy that undergirded French ideas seem really wildly misguided, even kind of laughable in retrospect. And yet, right? The notion that counterinsurgents can somehow structurally adjust a society to the point that insurgencies become unsustainable has persisted. One sort of final thought I'll leave you with, and then I promise I'll be done, is that the story of pacification is ultimately a Franco-Algerian story, right? And as good as historians and political scientists are at understanding insurgents and counterinsurgents, I think we leave the people who endure or experience this form of social warfare out of the story at our own peril, right? If counterinsurgency is a war through and on civilians, then we can't truly understand it until we see them as more than simply a human terrain, but as actors engaged in the war in their own right. All right, thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much. We go to questions. Actually, I should have mentioned at the beginning that people watching online can pose questions. What do they, Eliana, what do they actually do to pose their questions online? Just
Those have priority for questions.
Yeah. No, but I mean the online people watching it. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah, I see one there. Okay, so we will start first. Questions to fellows. You'll have to forgive me that I don't know many names here. I've not been around recently. So I see. Yeah. Okay.
Maybe the mic or speak loudly.
Sure, I'll say.
And if you would give your names, that would be helpful, and your status, so to speak.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Alana Resnick. I'm a visiting scholar in CSAC, and I'm an anthropologist from UC Santa Barbara. I'm really interested in the role of ethnographers in your story, and I'm wondering, I have two questions. Do you engage at all with Pierre Bourdieu's outline of a theory of practice? Because it was written during, he was doing ethnography of the Algerian Civil War as he's writing it. And I think that work is actually really interesting in terms of what he's finding and in terms of what your findings are. I think the piece is often used as a theoretical kind of social theory piece, but the ethnography of it is, I think, really intersects with some of your oral history findings. And the other question is, do you think through the work of Fanon at all in how you're conceiving of sociality, resistance, and your kind of questioning of counterinsurgency?
Yeah, those are great questions. So, it's not just Sustel, it's not just Germaine Tillon, it's Bourdieu. French psychological warfare theorists are reading these ethnographers, these anthropologists, like as they're conducting the war, right? So they're in a way, not in so many words, but in a way thinking about habitus, right? And psychological warfare theory of the era sort of fits with that, right? The idea, if you can train a particular habitus, a particular sort of like embodied way of being, you can also change people's internal political and social loyalties is baked in to how they're thinking about the war, right? I think, in terms of Fanon, sure, right? Thinking about how people enter the war, how they come to see themselves as engaged in the struggle against the French. But I think I also like to push back a little bit against Fanon, because what you see on the ground, even from French documents, which are incredibly biased, right, in favor of the French perspective, is a really complicated, changing set of social relationships. It's not just people and the FLN and the French army. It's a range of local militias who change their loyalties over and over. You've got regional and local rivalries between different villages and patrilineal families that seize on different sides to fight a struggle that's really, in a lot of ways, unrelated to the war, right? And so, Fanon's really great for thinking about how people do become engaged, but he can also, I think, erase a certain level of complexity.
Harold, you had your hand up.
Thanks, Terry. This is fantastic talk. Really interesting work. Harold Trincunas, Deputy Director here at CSAC. I'm wondering if you could reflect on how the participation in counterinsurgency affects armies. Because thinking of the legacy of sort of the French coin experience all over Latin America, which is the region I'm most familiar with, it can drive in two directions. It can either cause sort of a left-wing reaction, which would happen in Peru. You get a socialist revolution in '68 led by the military, or Portugal, '74, or you get this extreme right-wing reaction, which is you see in Argentina, in Chile, and El Salvador. So maybe if you could address that as well, how the experience of participating in counterinsurgency affects militaries over the long term.
Yeah, this is a question I'm super interested in, right? So I've written on sort of why French doctrine spreads and the ways that it spreads, right? And a lot of it's through these networks of military academies, right? You know, all of the Latin American states you just mentioned, both visit Algeria and then have a French training delegation go visit them. And they have sort of like these really different outcomes, right? The Portuguese military, for its war in Angola, adopts almost wholesale French strategy and just sort of renames, right? And then goes sort of leftwards, right? The Argentines do much of the same with what the French call interior territorial defense, which becomes the sort of, you know, the death squads in Argentina are really highly modeled on that, right? Why do they throw people out of helicopters in Argentina? That's the crevette bijard, right? Bijard shrimp, that's a practice pioneered around Algiers, right? And so I'm still thinking about sussing out like the politics that are bound up in that. I will say though that counterinsurgent militaries learn from the people they engage much more than we give them credit for, right? One of the arguments I make in the book is that Algerians are driving the evolution of French strategy based on who they will engage with. These sort of clandestine secret agents that are trained and reimplanted in villages, that program fails almost immediately because Algerians see right through it and they're not interested, right? The Jamaah is this village institution that's been around for centuries. You can't just replace it by a clandestinely trained guy. Like everybody figures out what's going on right away, like literally within 5 days, right? But they will engage social services. And so then social services become the centerpiece for pacification. So I think that's part of the pitch I made at the end, why we have to think about the people as well.
Alan? Oh.
Hello, thanks for the talk. I'm Alan Weiner from the law school. I'll abuse my role and do two questions. One's really quick though. So with respect to Lacoste, I was just a little unclear about the story about the extraordinary measures he was taking. You talked about, you know, efforts to have, you know, deal with the settlers. I couldn't really tell whether this was kind of a state of exception, which was meant to give him a free hand as against the Algerians or against the French settlers who were there. The broader question is, you know, I'm wondering if the problem is with the social services and the bathing, or whether it was the fact that the paratroopers were there showing up, you know, carrying out, you know, arrests and repression at the same time. We know from our own, you know, Joe Felter and Jake Shapiro, right, that when we cease abusing and are more respectful of civilian populations, I mean, counterinsurgency kind of does work. We get better cooperation, better information from the local population. So a lot of the talk seems to focus on the, again, the kind of the social service aspects of it. But it seems to me that, or am I wrong, that the real problem was the ongoing repression of the local population?
Yeah, those are great questions. So the question about Lacoste, what happens is the French Senate passes an emergency powers bill, right? So they pass him emergency powers. And that is, the answer to that is both. It's both to deal with the FLN and to deal with the Algerian settlers, you know, French settlers in Algeria, which by that point, a lot of particularly metropolitan French legislators see as much of a problem for them as the FLN, right? So those emergency powers are there both to allow the military to assume full police powers and do whatever they will, but also so that they can bypass the sort of gridlocked Algerian assembly, the legislative branch in Algeria. The question about violence is I think a really critical one, right? It's sort of hard to say. The question I always get is like, could these programs have worked if the French army wasn't so repressive? And I think the answer is no, because they are themselves sort of culturally violent, right? They are articulated from a colonial perspective that sees Algerian culture, familial structures, society as something inherently backward and problematic. And these programs are incredibly patronizing, right? You have these teams of social assistants showing up in the middle of desert towns in eastern Algeria where there's no active well, lecturing women on washing their hands before touching their babies and after they're preparing food, and they must, make sure that they wash and scrub their house and right? So there's a sort of cultural and social violence embodied in that, but also there's actual violence, right? Many of these programs end up essentially dealing with the effects of the violence of the war, right? One of the old canards of the Algerian War is that the Shaw Plan that starts in 1959 is, they win the war militarily and lose it politically. But in fact, the violence of the Shaw Plan is married with an effort to ramp these up. And what happens is the army plows through villages, ends up killing many of the men, arresting, violently interrogating with torture many of the inhabitants of the villages, and then these teams march in the aftermath. So they're really sort of inseparable in that kind of way. The repressive aspects of the war are married to these ideas of social reform. Okay.
Thank you very much, Terrence, for a very interesting presentation. I'm Yu Tiejun from School of International Studies of Peking University, and now APAC China Policy Fellow, a former CSAC visiting scholar 20 years ago. We also talk about this kind of issues, counterinsurgency or counter-terrorism in China, but we are quite reluctant to use the counterinsurgency because we were Communist Party used to be the insurgent, the other side. I'm curious about, I think it's counterinsurgency, those kind of issues are a permanent form of warfare across the space and time. So I'm very interested in that. I'm curious about how you mentioned about the colonial luxury, Charles Martry as his writings, and the model of pacification. Is there any? I'm curious. Is there any in his writing? I cannot read French because any connection with the writings before, like Thompson, Robert Thompson in Malaysia's counterinsurgency experience, and even in 1930s and 1940s, the Japanese has done quite a successful counterinsurgency in China's northeast, Manchukuo, for within 12 years, they conquered these areas and killing thousands of people. But pacification in terms of quite successful. Is there a connection of, the French model with other experience?
Yeah, so the French are drawing on anybody they can, right? And they're doing that self-consciously. They are sending officers to other militaries. They do this, sort of like not great thing in retrospect with the British military, where they send these officers to pair off. Like one pair goes to Algeria and sees what's happening. The other goes to Kenya, right? In these two sort of repressive counterinsurgencies at that moment. They send, the sort of Jedburgh connection is always there. So there's like actual literal connections with other militaries through the Second World War. All of these allied militaries are talking at the same time. And some of the intellectual connections are really interesting because, again, many of these officers have spent a lot of time fighting in Indochina. And many of them spend a lot of time in Viet Minh re-education camps. And so they're very familiar, not just with the Western canon, but they're reading Mao, right? Their favorite saying is, the insurgent is to the population as a fish is to water. That's Mao, right? One of the criticisms that's leveled at these French officers, particularly in the Psychological Warfare Bureau, they have this sort of like recitation practice when they're writing their doctrinal documents that looks a lot like Maoist theorizing. And it's a sort of vulgarized, like half-informed way of doing it. But they're really taken with the idea that particularly communist movements in Asia have discovered something about warfare that the West is behind, right? So they're drawing on, a sort of a wide range of people to try to figure out modern warfare, right? The Robert Thompson connection comes later. So Galula gets a postdoc at Harvard and then becomes the darling of Rand. And in 1964, Rand puts together this great conference. You can download the meeting minutes from the conference on Rand's website with all these famous counterinsurgents where they literally, this is the moment where they mock up that term counterinsurgency, right? They don't like revolutionary warfare. That's a little bit too Maoist for Americans. And so counterinsurgency is the concept that they come up with.
Could I just follow up on the Robert Thompson thing? Because the British had their own kind of, experience of counterinsurgency and their own views about it. So how strong was the French influence there? What differences would you see between British experience and British approach? Because I don't remember the kind of revolutionary warfare element in British counterinsurgency.
Yeah, the sort of where the French bear the most influence is on other anti-communists, right? And so there's a sort of a Latinate connection, deeply influential on the Spanish and Portuguese militaries, the Argentine, Brazilian militaries, right? The Anglo counterinsurgency sphere has its own traditions. The Americans will listen to the French when it comes to jungle war fighting and some of that stuff as they head into Vietnam, right? They really like the idea of strategic villages, but the British are also doing that, right? It's sort of there's not a vector from one to the other so much as a conversation that's ongoing at the time. And so, the French aren't super duper influential on the British, actually. The British sort of maintain their traditional Francophobia and the same with the French, right? There are sort of different strands within that counterinsurgency canon that emerges in the early 1960s. And you get these sort of weird leapfrog moments, like when Galula gets picked up by American counterinsurgency thinkers in the early 2000s, right? He wasn't super influential for thinking about Vietnam, even.
Yeah. Norman.
My questions are very similar. I'm Norman Neymark. I'm in the history department, Hoover and CSAC. My questions are related to the previous two. Actually, it's basically the same question in a slightly different form. I'll put it. Could you restate in some senses what the basic thesis is about the counterinsurgency in the French? Are you trying to say that that this is a kind of unique phenomenon that they have more or less introduced into the system of war and warfare, or are you just saying it's another stage? Because again, I see all of the precedents and all of the parallels to the French, and you answered the question yourself in some ways by saying this is inherent in some senses in colonialism, period. I was thinking about the Americans in the Caribbean, where they're, engaging in very similar kinds of programs in the early 20th century. So how do you, what are you trying to say, in other words, in a large sense, about this piece of the Algerian War?
So the argument that I'm making is, it's both yes and no. How about that for an academic answer, right? I would say the French counterinsurgents themselves say that they've discovered something new, and what they're doing is deeply unique, right? The argument I make in the book is actually that's not true. What they do is they capture the zeitgeist of the moment very well, right? And in doing so, are able to drive a sort of project of armed social reform to the heart of modern warfare, right? Modern warfare is not just about killing your enemy till they're dead. It's also about doing all these other things to sort of like erase the conditions for insurgency, right? And the French, again, are not alone in doing that. They're doing this at the same time and in dialogue with the Americans, the British, the Portuguese, right? I think in being very clear about how that should work and in providing resources to other militaries, they push that whole conversation forward, right? And so, you know, we often, when we think about like military intellectual genealogy, we often think there's like one arrow, right? And it goes like one way. And part of what I've tried to do, not just with this book, but with some articles I've written, is think about like the ways that militaries in the past are actually in conversation. Like, why do we have a counterinsurgency canon? Like, why do we talk about Rob Thompson and David Galula and you know, Roger Trinquier and some of these guys? It's because that conversation is happening in the past, in that moment, and those are the canon texts that they decide are going to be the canon, right? Militaries across the globe are modernizing and professionalizing in this specific moment of the 1950s and 60s, and counterinsurgency is the new hotness, right? That's like the new paradigm, the new gray zone, or whatever, you know, whatever you want to call it. That's sort of what they all settle on. So it's not so much that the French are doing something unique and having a unique influence, but rather that they are one of the motors driving this shift in how people are thinking about warfare.
Okay, let me pick up on one of our online questions from Jeffrey Rothwell, whom some may remember was here for many years. And he now is living in Antibes, where some of the settlers moved, turning the Côte d'Azur and Provence to the right politically. So his question to you is, can you say more about the settlers? After all, of course you mentioned them. They are a crucial part of the history because they're so unwilling to carry out reforms.
Yeah, I mean, so the role of the settlers is interesting. I mean, one of the methodologies I engaged in doing this research, right? I didn't talk a whole lot about methods, but one of my key methodologies is to read different groups off one another. We often talk about the French army or the colonial state. Really, you have a bunch of different stakeholders who are trying to do different things and totally disagree with each other, right? And the sort of the settlers are a key example of that, right? They have their own political machinations. They have their own role in the war. And the folks in charge of the French army at a given moment in this 8 years of the war have very different attitudes toward them. So in 55 and 56, 57, they're a big problem. They're the source of all racism. Couldn't possibly be, you know, metropolitan French. They're not racist, right? You know, they've done something to turn colonialism wrong. And then in 1958, when the French military stages a coup that collapses the French government and reinstalls Charles de Gaulle as president, French get a new constitution, right? The settlers invest really heavily in that, and suddenly they're an ally, right? And then you have a fracturing of the French military as de Gaulle engages towards a path of self-determination for Algeria. And the settlers, many of the most radical among them, then ally themselves with various factions of the French army, like anti-communists and some of these die-hard pro-colonial forces from the Armée d'Afrique. And literally, you know, they splinter off, they form a terrorist organization and begin fighting the French army and the FLN itself, right? So it's a very sort of messy situation. The sort of outcome of that splintering and everyone constituting the settlers as a problem is that there's a mass exodus. Nearly all of them, except the sort of lefty-leaning ones, leave at the end of the war and resettle in the south of France. Antibes and some of these cities are where I conducted a lot of my oral histories because there's a lot of former French officers who fought in the army there.
Sorry, Harold, you're pointing at somebody. I can't. Oh,
I'm not sure you can see her from.
yes.
Yeah, absolutely. But I do have a question after that.
Well, I have more questions here, Rob and another. Yeah.
Hi, thanks so much. This was super interesting. I am curious to hear a little bit more about the role of decolonization and the Algerian motivation to resist some of these pacification forms. It strikes me that that is a major reason why they weren't successful, in addition to what you mapped out earlier, that they were themselves a form of violence. The violence was, you know, kind of countered by this vision for decolonization and independence. And then sort of a follow-up to that, what role does decolonization have today and the effectiveness of counterinsurgencies, this kind of continued desire of frame or continued desire for independence and framing within decolonization and undermining the effectiveness of counterinsurgency?
A great question. So decolonization is such a loaded term then and now, right? And it's really, I think, an analytic term. And so when I look at Algerians, and I've tried to think about Algerians and how they engage these programs and to see their engagement, which is often, effaced from these archival records, one of the things I think about is like, what are their motives, right? And what is driving Algerians to finally organically in 1960 rise up and openly reject these pacification programs, right? And part of the reason why the FLN is successful and part of the reason why Algerians hate these programs is that recruitment is based on these extended patrilineal structures, right? Algerian social life is built around the Jama'a in rural areas, right? People hold those structures dearly, right? Your family or clan, your village council, like these are sort of, that village council is a really sort of democratic grassroots way of resolving. It's by consensus, right? Families send a delegate, they talk about all the problems they're having, they agree on a solution that everybody can agree on, and that's it, right? People are loath to give that up, right? And I think, Algerians engage with these programs or don't, often based, all politics is local, often based on local politics. You've got these great incidents where, the French army thinks they're making inroads in the sort of southern part of the Algiers zone with families. And it's because those families hate another group that's allied themselves with the FLN, right? And so they're like playing the army off the FLN for reasons that have really nothing to do with the war, right? So, I think one of the, if we want to think about, scholars talk a lot about decolonizing the past or whatever, I think one of the problems I have with the Fanonian interpretation of the Algerian War, and one of the things scholars could do better is to take Algerians seriously as actors and think about their motives and the ways that they engage and what they're trying to accomplish. Because, thinking about like the people in the French army and the FLN doesn't really get you very far for understanding dynamics on the ground.
Right, Rob, and then
Welcome back, Sherry. Going to your theme of contingency, what role does the defeat of 1940 play in your story?
Great question. So, there's a very old argument that the French army was traumatized by a series of defeats, and this is what drove them to torture and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that doesn't really hold up, right? One of the interesting things about torture is when you read the documents in the French army about what they call muscled interrogations, right? They're talking about themselves as, dispassionate technocrats. They're technicians, right? Why do they use electricity? It's, beating a man with your fists is passion, it involves passion, right? And energy. Electricity is sort of clinical and impersonal, right? But I think that they actually, right? What 1940 and then about the shortcomings in their model of warfare, they throw out the door all of the old strategies, right? So that old story says they're traumatized, that's why they get so extreme, right? It's just like a more extreme version of the same old colonial violence. Actually, what this trauma does is it drives immense experimentation on the ground, right? From Madagascar to Indochina to Algeria, the French army is trying to figure out a doctrine of warfare that's going to work to fight all these forces assailing their empire. They never quite.
And Stig J. Hansen, I'm a visiting scholar here, and I happen to be editing a volume on post-Afghanistan counterinsurgency, so that it's great. And I really liked your talk because you were going into the details and you gave, as you said, Algerians an agency, and you see the nitty-gritty and don't fall into the trap of covering law explanations. But I'm going to push you a little bit anyway. It's very interesting when you talk about the Jamia and the consuls, because I think I saw some of the things you're saying, for example, in Mozambique, which you happen to say took some of the counterinsurgency. Portugal took some of the counterinsurgency from France, then Frelimo took something from Portugal. So this is very interesting. But I really wonder to which extent you think the strategies you are describing are based on modernization theory within development studies. And secondly, if this created a lot of problems in relation to the Jamia, that you actually go in and actively try to dismantle them. And then I want to force you to do some generalizations nevertheless. I feel bad about it, but I wonder what your thinking are on the current discussions after the Afghanistan failure, the new approaches to counterinsurgency, brutalization approach, and the critique of the often very badly defined hearts and minds approaches.
Those are great questions. I'm going to try to remember them all. So if I forget one, hit me up. I think modernization theory, as we think about it, is a very Anglo concept, right? And the French have their own sort of long school of modernization theory, right? That's developed sort of in situ in France as Paris looks out to the sort of rural parts of France, but also in the French Empire. And so, these guys they're not reading a lot of the sort of classic modernization theorists. Although, again, if you think about this ongoing dialogue, one of the sort of founding thinkers. So there is this ongoing conversation. They're sort of picking it osmotically. They're picking it up, right? But they're not really reading the sort of what we would think of as the canon of Anglo modernization theory, right? In terms of the question about what do I think about the whole debate about part of it is I'll find a cross-inside study something. So otherwise, we have a situation like people who have something that's different. I will say, though, one of the things that this book project has sort of taught me is to be really skeptical of the idea that cultural knowledge is really actionable at all. Right? Like, can we use cultural knowledge effectively? It makes sense, right, that we could use cultural knowledge to make our form of warfare better or more acceptable or whatever, but I don't think it's actually actionable in that way. I think, this is me being a historian, but like social relations are so irreducibly complicated, it's really hard to instrumentalize them. And so I think often, and the French campaign in Algeria is a classic example of this, right? Thinking about instrumentalizing social relations, about creating some sort of technique-based apparatus that can fight warfare is a great way to not think about strategy or objectives or outcomes, right? And so I think that is one clear lesson that I will trumpet after writing this book, which is that, much of the French war becomes like, let's, just do this circular strategy we came up with and we'll like divine how it's working and the reactions of Algerians. And they don't have any like actionable vision for how war is going to end. There is no political goal other than keep Algeria French and make it more French. And that's, frankly, not a realistic goal in the way they've articulated it from the very beginning. That's a very big answer, but
I think we may be time for just one more question. Harold, you had one you wanted to give, but actually I'd rather. Yes. I have a question online from Martha Crenshaw. Do you see connections between the Revolutionary War military and the OAS and the military coup attempts on the goal?
Yeah, so I think again, I'm always like trying to nuance things in a really annoying way, right? So the old story is that Revolutionary War theory led directly to the OAS, right? And there's a one-to-one sort of equivalence. And I think it's more complicated. All of these guys, in fact, join the OAS. So Rousseau doesn't, right? Neither do any of his subordinates. You have a minority, though, who do. And they bring those ideas into the OAS and the way that the OAS operates, right? And so, you know, again, yeah, there actually is like a direct connection. You can see it in their propaganda really clearly, that the OAS spreads. It's